Test environments and the data we place inside them quietly shape the security of an organization, and they also shape whether test results deserve to be trusted. In the real world, security testing rarely fails because someone misunderstood a scanner output, and it more often fails because the environment was unrealistic or the data was mishandled. When you test against an environment that is too open, too privileged, or too unlike production, you end up validating assumptions instead of validating controls. When you test with data that carries unnecessary sensitivity, you create avoidable exposure, and you pressure teams to cut corners just to keep moving. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISS books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A well-managed test environment should resemble production in the ways that matter for security, while still protecting real operations from disruption. That balance is subtle because production environments include controls, dependencies, and constraints that influence behavior, and a stripped-down testbed can unintentionally remove the very friction that reveals weaknesses. At the same time, copying production too literally can expose live integrations, create accidental load, or allow test activity to leak into operational systems where it does not belong. The goal is not a perfect clone, and it is a representative environment that preserves relevant controls and failure modes without introducing operational risk. To make that possible, you start with disciplined environment segregation that separates development, test, staging, and production as distinct zones with clear purpose and boundaries. Development is where change is frequent and experimentation is expected. Test is where functionality and security properties are exercised. Staging is where release candidates prove they can survive production-like conditions, and production is where stability and confidentiality take priority. When those boundaries are blurred, you create a path for unreviewed code, unvetted configurations, and untrusted data to flow into sensitive areas. Segregation also helps with accountability because you can attach specific rules and monitoring to each environment based on its intended risk posture. Segregation only works when it is reinforced with access controls that match the sensitivity of the environment and the activity taking place. In secure testing, the question is not just who can log in, and it is who can deploy, who can modify configurations, who can view logs, and who can access data stores or administrative consoles. If every developer can change anything at any time, you lose the ability to interpret test outcomes because the target is constantly shifting and the provenance of changes becomes unclear. Access controls are also a security boundary because a test system that is broadly accessible can become a convenient stepping stone for an attacker to reach other environments. The data you use for testing deserves the same careful design as the systems you test, and the safest default is to avoid real, personal, or confidential information whenever possible. Real datasets are tempting because they feel realistic, but realism is not the same as necessity, and many tests do not require actual identities, actual account numbers, or actual business records. When real sensitive data enters a test pipeline, the organization inherits all the obligations of protecting it, even if the environment was never engineered to meet production-grade protections. In practice, the best posture is to treat test data as intentionally designed input, not as a convenient copy of what happens to exist in production. When real values are difficult to avoid, data masking becomes a central technique for reducing exposure while keeping datasets useful. Masking hides sensitive fields, but it preserves the format and the structural properties that applications depend on, such as length, character sets, and checksums where needed. The key is that masked data should still behave like the original data for validation purposes, so your tests remain meaningful without exposing the underlying sensitive content. If masking is done poorly, you either break applications in test and lose velocity, or you keep too much fidelity and lose the security benefit, so the implementation has to be deliberate. Tokenization takes a different approach by replacing sensitive values with substitutes and by keeping the mapping in a protected service rather than in the dataset itself. In tokenization, the token is what systems see and store, and only authorized services can resolve tokens back to original values when that resolution is truly required. This design is valuable because the dataset can be widely used for testing workflows and logic without containing the original sensitive material. Tokenization does, however, introduce dependency on the token service and its access controls, so you need to treat that service as a high-value component with strong authentication, authorization, and audit trails.
Synthetic data generation expands your options further by creating realistic data sets that represent the patterns you need without corresponding to real individuals or real records. Good synthetic data respects distributions, correlations, and edge cases, which matters because security failures often hide in unusual inputs, boundary conditions, or unexpected combinations of values. When you generate data intentionally, you can also create targeted sets for abuse cases, performance limits, and authorization boundaries without dragging sensitive production artifacts into the process. The practical benefit is that you can scale testing safely, iterate faster, and still maintain the realism necessary to validate security properties like input handling and access enforcement. All of the above becomes less meaningful if secrets are mishandled, because credentials and keys are often the fastest route from a test environment into something more sensitive. Secrets management exists to prevent embedding credentials in code repositories, build scripts, or configuration files where they will be copied, logged, and rediscovered later. Once a secret is committed, it tends to live forever in history, backups, and caches. And even if you rotate it, you still have proof that the organization allowed that pattern to occur. Proper secrets management centralizes storage, controls access by role and need, and supports rotation so that test credentials remain limited in scope and lifetime. Logging in test environments needs equal care because logs can quietly collect sensitive test data that nobody intended to retain. Debug logging often captures request bodies, headers, session identifiers, or payloads, and those details can include masked fields that were not actually masked everywhere, or tokens that should not be replayable. The goal is to capture what you need to validate security controls and troubleshoot failures, while avoiding unnecessary collection of sensitive content that creates new exposure. In secure practice, you treat logs as data stores with their own confidentiality risks, and you decide intentionally what is recorded, what is redacted, and how long it is retained. Configuration parity is where environment management meets result validity, because security testing only has meaning when the tested behavior reflects production-relevant behavior. If production enforces strong transport protection, strict authorization checks, hardened headers, and conservative timeouts, but the test environment does not, then a passing result does not prove the control works where it matters. Parity does not mean everything is identical, and it means the security-affecting configurations, control points, and dependencies are aligned, so that the same categories of failure would appear in test. When parity is maintained, test findings become actionable, and when parity is ignored, testing becomes a source of false confidence. Even when parity is achieved, change control is what prevents uncontrolled drift that invalidates outcomes over time. Drift happens when people apply quick fixes, temporary bypasses, or one-off adjustments to keep testing moving, and those changes accumulate until the environment no longer represents what you think it represents. With change control, modifications are tracked, reviewed at the right level, and tied back to a purpose so you can explain why the environment differs and whether that difference matters to your results. This discipline is also what allows you to reproduce findings, because you can return to a known state instead of debating what changed between yesterday's run and today's failure. Cleanup processes close the loop by removing temporary data, accounts, and artifacts after testing, which reduces both security exposure and operational confusion. Test environments naturally create debris, including transient user accounts, elevated permissions granted for troubleshooting, test keys, sample files, and temporary datasets that were never intended to persist. If that debris remains, it becomes a long-term attack surface and a source of misinterpretation because someone later may treat old artifacts as current truth. Cleanup should be systematic and dependable so that environments return to a clean baseline, and so that sensitive traces do not linger beyond the period where they are justified.
When you put all of this together, you end up with a testing posture that is safer and also more credible. Controlled environments protect production operations while still preserving the security controls and constraints that determine real behavior. Safe test data practices reduce exposure, simplify compliance obligations, and keep teams focused on validating controls rather than managing avoid-all incidents. Trustworthy validation comes from the combination of segregation, disciplined access, carefully designed data, managed secrets, careful logging, configuration alignment, controlled change, and reliable cleanup. And that combination is what turns testing from a checkbox into evidence you can stand behind.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.